Sarah, any update?
I haven't had the chance to ask the president if he's fighting with Peter Griffin.
On January 6, 2021, a mob of several thousand Trump supporters swarmed the U.S. Capitol in Washington, D.C. Over the course of several hours, they overwhelmed police, smashed windows, broke into the Capitol, and swarmed the Senate floor, giving the politicians inside only minutes to escape. For months, Trump himself and his followers had warned that if the results of the 2020 election did not turn out in their favor, they would take drastic action. Enraged by the mail-in votes that had pushed then-President-elect Biden to the highest seat in the nation, Trump's followers indeed fulfilled their promise, and at a rally in D.C. where the votes were being finalized, they made their attempt at a coup. For years, anti-fascist activists, people of color, and anyone with a history degree had been warning Americans of what was coming. I can't help but remember a Twitter thread where this guy laid out exactly how living through collapse like this can feel. But somehow many of us were completely blindsided by Trump's ascendance to the presidency. They didn't see it coming. Now, I think one of the biggest causes of this is baked into American media culture. Spectacle. They memed on Trump throughout his campaign, his presidency, all the way up to the insurrection. Corporate media outlets like CNN gave him nothing but attention because he gave them views, he gave them ratings, he gave them spectacle. And many people want a good spectacle but can't understand when they're watching on the TV something that is going to be dangerous. And part of that is because Trump was just never taken seriously. He was constantly just a joke, an embarrassment, and people didn't understand why. It gave him all that attention but played off every attempt to see him as a real threat, and never named him for what he so clearly was from the beginning, a fascist. Some historians didn't even want to call him that until after the insurrection. Then suddenly it was okay to call him a fascist, even though that should have been obvious from the moment he was calling immigrants rapists and thugs invading our nation. But even before Trump, a fascist authoritarian was an inevitable progression of American politics. For years, the actual differences policy-wise between Democrats and Republicans had become less related to their actual policies economically or on climate change or on war or anything like that, and more related to their rhetoric regarding minorities and identity politics, culture warring. Years of economic policy blending together into universal neoliberalism, while social policy and rhetoric constantly swung farther right for every inch it swung left in order to distract from the fading differences between the Democrats and Republicans, meant that at the very least, someone with Trump's style of rhetoric was inevitable. I mean, we watched as dank meme culture became a tool for the far right to sneak messages into the mainstream under the veil of irony, as conversations about movies and games became breeding grounds for violent misogyny and racism over and over and over again, as attempts to appease both sides instead instigated rage. Government and administration became adept at concocting false reality itself to justify their actions, manipulating conspiracy theories and committing acts of societal gaslighting. And no one saw it coming. A president like Trump was guaranteed after Obama left office. Hillary honestly never stood a single bit of a chance. And let's stop pretending she did. Trump was a backlash. Like black people lynched and left hanging after black political advancement, he was a response and a warning from white people enraged that a Negro had tainted the highest seat in their country. What Trump would represent to this country was the culmination of the last 50 or 60 years of American politics, and baked deeply and inherently within American culture, ideas, history, and systems, that no one saw it coming because on some level it also felt familiar. Today, our goal is to take a step back and re-examine our understanding of America's political climate. With the help of several texts that I highly recommend you read, Alt America, Hitler's American Friends, and an essay by someone who lived through Italian fascism in the 40s, Umberto Eco's Or Fascism. We're going to discuss the history behind America's fascist movements and proto-fascist elements within the nation's origins, and at the end we're going to go through Eco's 14 points identifying fascism and discuss how each one fits our current modern-day context. The goal is not to be perfectly detailed, but to establish some sort of narrative line by which we can identify fascist or fascism-adjacent movements, as well as overt ones in the past that led into what we have now. By the end of this, hopefully you'll have not only an understanding of where we stand now, but where this all came from, where it factored into everything else, and how we can fight it now. And just before we get into that, I would like to give a moment to plug my Patreon and coffee and stuff like that, because making videos like this, especially these really long ones, takes a lot out of me, especially when it comes to talking about like this topic and like my own personal mental health. It's a lot, and doing things like subscribing on Patreon or donating on Ko-fi, if that's possible to you, can be really helpful to making this work, I guess you can call it, sustainable, and alleviating some other things that might give me stress in my life, like affording groceries and stuff for my cat. So yeah, thank you. On with the video.
بیانی کیزو هتاری کیرون لو بلا چاو بلا چاو بلا چاو چاو چاو.
Colonialism and imperialism have not settled their debt to us once they have withdrawn their flag and their police force from our territories. For centuries, capitalists have behaved like real war criminals in the underdeveloped world. Deportation, massacres, forced labor, and slavery were the primary methods used by capitalism to increase its gold and diamond reserves and establish its wealth and power. Not so long ago, Nazism transformed the whole of Europe into a genuine colony. The governments of various European nations demanded reparations and the restitution in money and kind for their stolen treasures. As a result, cultural artifacts, paintings, sculptures, and stained glass windows were returned to their owners. In the aftermath of the war, the Europeans were adamant about one thing: Germany will pay. At the opening of the Eichmann trial, Mr. Adenauer, on behalf of the German people, once again asked forgiveness from the Jewish people. At the same time, we are of the opinion that the imperialist states would be making a serious mistake and committing an unspeakable injustice if they were content to withdraw from our soil the military cohorts and the administrative and financial services whose job it was to prospect for, extract, and ship our wealth to the metropolis. Moral reparation for national independence does not fool us and doesn't feed us. The wealth of the imperialist nations is also our wealth. At a universal level, such a statement means in no way we feel implicated in the technical feats or artistic creations of the West. In concrete terms, Europe has been bloated out of all proportions by the gold and raw materials from such colonial countries as Latin America, China, and Africa. Today, Europe's tower of opulence faces these continents for centuries, the point of departure of their shipments of diamonds, oil, silk, and cotton, timber, and exotic produce to this very same Europe. Europe is literally the creation of the Third World. The riches which are choking it are those plundered from the underdeveloped peoples. The Wretched of the Earth, Frantz Fanon and Richard Philcox. Talking about American-style fascism kind of requires us to go really deep into history, into a time period before actual fascism as we understand it now came to be. Now, this is because much of what we would come to see as fascism, the tools, the trades, and the tactics, were developed by nation-states engaging in empire building during the colonial period. From about the 1500s to the early 1900s, where we start to see the collapse of a lot of larger empires and the conditions that led to World War I and II. Why? Both wars between larger colonial powers over who would get to be the dominant power. That power turned out to be America, which came away from World War II with more than 50% of the entire world's wealth. One, by playing both sides in the war until the last possible second, and then curb stomping Japan into the dust. Twice. But for colonization to happen and work in the first place, there was a desperate need for laborers to perform the jobs that were needed to go to another country, subjugate its people, and steal its resources, to return to the homeland. Now, colonizers accomplished this in multiple ways. One was sending their own nation's undesirable populations, the cripplingly poor, criminals, etc., to colonies to function as that force, along with employees from government-sponsored companies and soldiers. It was pretty common for even regular workers for these companies to get pretty shit treatment because capitalism's gonna capitalize. Columbus's workers famously despised him for being a liar and a cheat who would steal money from them, but that's a digression. The next method, or rather the next step, was to subjugate the local population to serve as an underclass performing harder labor that white people didn't want to do. In the Americas, Spain accomplished this with brutal genocidal violence, wiping out villages entirely if they resisted white rule, building brutal mining and labor camps, and many worse brutal methods. Spain's driving goal for this venture was to find gold, and in a time period from 1492 to now, indigenous peoples in the Americas would be subject to genocidal policy formed to fit the needs of what would become capitalism. Read Christopher Columbus's writing on his journey across the Americas for a first-hand account from a colonizer, where he is overtly racist, muses happily on enslaving the indigenous peoples, including the Arawak and Taino people he would drive nearly to extinction, and depicting his acts of brutality from his own mouth. After just 2 years of Spanish rule, the Arawaks had suffered the deaths of more than half their population. So Las Casas reports, they suffered and died in the mines and other labors in desperate silence, knowing not a soul in the world to whom they could turn to for help. He describes their work in the mines. Mountains are stripped from top to bottom, and bottom to top 1,000 times. They dig, split rocks, move stones, and carry dirt on their backs to wash it in the rivers, while those who wash gold stay in the water all the time with their backs bent, so constantly it breaks them. And when water invades the mines, the most arduous task of all is to dry the mines by scooping up panfuls of water and throwing it up outside. After 6 or 8 months of work in the mines, which was the time required of each crew to dig enough gold for melting, up to 1/3 of the men died. While the men were sent many miles away to the mines, the wives remained to work the soil, forced into the excruciating job of digging and making thousands of hills for cassava plants. Thus, husbands and wives were together only once every 8 or 10 months, and when they met, they were so exhausted and depressed on both sides, they ceased to procreate. As for the newly born, they died early because their mothers, overworked and famished, had no milk to nurse them. And for this reason, while I was in Cuba, 7,000 children died in 3 months. Some mothers even drowned their babies from sheer desperation. In this way, husbands died in the mines, wives died at work, and children died from lack of milk. And in a short time, this land, which was so great, so powerful, and so fertile, was depopulated. My eyes have seen these acts so foreign to human nature, and now I tremble as I write. The Spanish quest for gold was pretty fruitless. While some places saw large gold yields, many places like Haiti or Saint-Domingue saw little fruit, and settlers decided to sell the workers on these gold mines into slavery to make up for the small gold yields. On Saint-Domingue, slaves who failed to bring enough gold were killed or mutilated as punishment. It was common for a worker who failed to provide their quota, something often fundamentally impossible because there just wasn't that much gold, to have a hand cut off as punishment. Bartolomé de las Casas, who was a priest during this time in Cuba and owned a plantation, wrote of the brutal labor conditions and genocide himself. Endless testimonies prove the mild and pacific temperament of the natives, but our work was to exasperate, ravage, kill, mangle, and destroy. Small wonder then if they tried to kill one of us now and then. The admiral, it is true, was blind as those who came after him, and he was so anxious to please the king that he committed irreparable crimes against Indians. There's a really good video by Overly Sarcastic Productions about the myth of El Dorado and how it was basically a fabrication of white people's imaginations. During the colonial period in South Africa, alongside being segregated from white people and settlers, it was common for there to be prison labor camps where the indigenous people would be made to work for the sake of colonial projects. This was actually around the time that prison started to become a more popular form of punishment outside of just detaining people waiting for a trial or punishment. In colonial nations, they were seen as a way to rehabilitate people. In colonized nations, they were labor camps. When they weren't in prison camps, indigenous people were segregated in work towns and only workers were allowed to enter, which separated many workers from their wives and children, since you literally weren't let in if you weren't a worker. Workers barely made enough money to send to their families outside of the work towns. This would evolve into the system of apartheid over time. Apartheid developed into a policy known as separate development, whereby each of the 9 African Bantu groups were to become a nation with its own homeland or Bantustan. An area totaling about 14% of the country's land was set aside for these homelands, the remainder, including the major mineral areas and the cities, being reserved for the whites. The basic tenet of the separate development policy was to reserve within the confines of the Africans' designated homeland rights and freedoms, but that outside it, blacks were to be treated as aliens. Movement to and between other parts of the country was strictly regulated. The location of residence or employment, if permitted to work, was restricted, and blacks were not allowed to vote or own land. Thus, African urban workers, including those who were 3rd or 4th generation city dwellers, were seen as transients, their real homes in rural reservations from which they or their ancestors migrated. Only those holding necessary labor permits granted according to the labor market were allowed to reside within urban areas. Such permits often did not include the spouse or family of a permit holder, contributing to the breakup of family life among many Africans. Most African urban dwellers had to live in townships on the city's perimeter. All Africans living outside the Bantustans were subject to strict curfew regulations and passbook requirements, especially in the cities. If unable to produce these when challenged, they were subject to arrest. The police were granted sweeping powers of preventive detention in 1962, initially for 30 days, later for indefinite periods. Many of these labor camps would go on to bear a similar structure to the U.S. prison system after slavery was reformed, which explicitly was reformed to allow for prison labor via convict lease systems and filled with workers by over-policing black bodies. The black codes and Jim Crow, along with harsh over-policing of black people in this period, would shift the prison population in America from majority white to majority black, and shift its focus from any actual rehabilitation, which is what prisons were billed as when they started becoming a thing in this period, to labor and punishment. But beforehand, the methods of subjugation for African people would bear the same kinds of brutality and violence as what was happening in the Americas. In the Congo, Belgian rule would lead to a genocide of Congolese people, based in the subjugation of their labor to make King Leopold very rich. People who failed to make their rubber quota had hands and feet removed. In one famous case, a man's daughter had her hand and foot removed, and then alongside her mother was cannibalized. The trophies were sent to him. There's a very powerful picture of this man staring at what remains of his family that I will not show you. In the Americas, many slaves didn't live past 25, especially in the Caribbean where sugar and molasses industries ruled, and were famously deadly. Many slaves were burned alive by melted sugar, had limbs crushed in machines, died of malnutrition, or died by other related means. The reason why so many black people were brought to the Americas was due to the particular brutality and mortality rate of industry here. In the U.S., slaves and freed people faced the same brutality in the cotton industry and on plantations. Beatings and lynchings were common for disobedient slaves. White people would often massacre groups of slaves to scare any possible dissenters, would hunt down slaves with dogs when they escaped, and had other harsh controls put on them. According to the black codes, there were crimes defined by state law for which only black people could be duly convicted. Thus, former slaves who had recently been extricated from the condition of hard labor for life could legally be sentenced to penal servitude. In the immediate aftermath of slavery, the southern states hastened to develop a criminal justice system that could legally restrict the possibilities of freedom for the newly released slaves. Black people became a primary target of a developing convict lease system, referred to by many as a reincarnation of slavery. Along with sharecropping came the black codes. Under these, if you weren't employed, you could be arrested and charged with vagrancy. If you weren't employed in any job that wasn't farming or servitude, you would be forced to pay a tax of up to $100. If you broke your labor contract, you'd be jailed, beaten, and forced to work on plantations. Along with poor black people, their children would also be forced to do this work under apprenticeship laws. There were restrictions on what jobs black people could work, how much they could be paid, where they could work, what property they could own, and even who they were allowed to testify against in court. Under the black codes, a black person literally couldn't testify in court unless it was against another black person and not a white person. Across the South, militia groups enforced these black codes with the backing of politicians and wealthy businessmen. These militia groups were made up of overseers from former slave days, Confederate veterans, and other racist groups rising in response to the newly freed slaves. A reactionary force, you might call them. Sounds kind of familiar. These instances of colonial violence we've just discussed were often justified with ideas of spreading Christianity to civilize and save indigenous people who didn't live like white people. Obviously, that's not what really happened. King Alfonso V appointed to Gomes de Zidara at the time, a member of Henry the Navigator's Military Order of Christ, the task of creating a biography of Portugal's travels in the Atlantic and around Africa. In 1453, he would publish the book The Chronicles of the Discovery and Conquest of Guinea. Within this book were laid the seeds of racial hierarchy and the beginnings of the commodification of blackness. Zurara's observations of black people were used to justify slavery, casting black people in a negative light that shaped the way they were viewed for the rest of history. Gomes de Zidara grouped all of these peoples from Africa into a single race for that very reason, to create hierarchy, the first racist idea. Race-making is an essential ingredient in the making of racist ideas, the crust that holds the pie. Once a race has been created, it must be filled in, and Zurara filled it with negative qualities that would justify Prince Henry's evangelical mission to the world. The black race of people was lost, living like beasts without any custom of reasonable beings. Zurara wrote, "They have no understanding of good, but only know how to live in a bestial sloth." The role of Christianity in these atrocities is not discussed enough, but it was absolutely vital. Dehumanizing colonized people along ethnic and religious lines provided a cover for the exploitation happening. We aren't killing Native American children and erasing their culture. We're just taking them from unfit mothers to be raised right and civilized. We're not beating and killing black slaves who speak their home language or practice their home religion. We're civilizing them, saving their souls. God wants them to be slaves, otherwise they die as heathen niggas and go to hell. Should note that slaves weren't really allowed to be able to read the Bible for themselves, and the conditions of slavery were more hellish than any imagined fiery pit. Manifest destiny was an idea backed by religious fervor that encouraged white people to spread across the American continent, spreading their culture and civilization with God's blessing as justification for ethnic cleansing and genocide of indigenous people, and ecocide from many of the areas they came to inhabit. The ideology served as the basis for Hitler's Nazi ideas on Lebensraum, and bears some resemblance to Zionism. In other words, colonization was a process with economic and religious goals that justified the cruelty to those who benefited from it. On top of this religious fervor for colonialism, though, there were also often attitudes of fear, scapegoating, and hatred against colonized people. White Americans had and still have a cultural paranoia of black slaves rising up, coming into their homes or neighborhoods for revenge and killing them, which you may note is still a trope in the modern day, with many white people having a fear of criminals, a dog whistle for black Americans, coming from cities where black people live to massacre them.
Picture this. You're sitting eating dinner in a restaurant with some of your friends on a Friday night. You're deep into conversation when in the distance you hear shouting. You look up and you see a group of demonstrators walking down the street, yelling and holding flags that say Black Lives Matter. The group is loud, but you don't have a problem with what you think they are saying. Of course Black Lives Matter. You agree with that completely. It seems obvious to you. You're against racism. You've never mistreated anyone because of his race. You're not a bad person. So at first it doesn't occur to you that this mob of angry people might be angry at you. Why would they be? But then suddenly the mob is there, at your table, screaming in your face, throwing chairs, smashing glasses, sweeping cutlery to the floor, threatening to kill you. Within seconds, you're running for your life. That happens in our country now.
This fear is replicated anywhere there are colonized people and justified preemptive violence against those people. This fervor was often stirred up in moments like the Wilmington Uprising, where white Americans butchered a democratically elected black government, or in Tulsa, or in the thousands of black people lynched and the thousands forced to flee the South in the period after the Civil War. We even saw a version of it last year during the George Floyd Uprising, when large, mostly peaceful rallies were demonized as riots, and rare battles with police localized to specific parts of cities were described as entire cities being burned by mobs of black people and Antifa, when really they were small-scale localized conflicts with police after the police initiated violence, or in the case of some places there were nightly battles in specific parts of the city. Once you walked a couple blocks and left the area, most of the time there wasn't really anything else going on. Groups like the KKK, who didn't identify as fascist at first but now absolutely are, would also make a habit of storming black neighborhoods, burning homes and businesses, and killing people. It was basically an ethnic cleansing, and these specific elements invoke similar violence done under fascism. With that, I think we should also point out how most Republican talking points at this point are identity politics in reaction to minorities receiving better rights, and on some level, often naturally conclude with fascist ideas. Taking down statues of slavers becomes erasing history, becomes erasing white culture, becomes white genocide. Trans people in bathrooms making women uncomfortable becomes pedophiles in the bathroom, which leads to rallies where fascists stab 2 people and try to paint a random trans woman as a pedophile, sending her death threats and abuse for something they physically could not have ever possibly done. This abides for reasons we'll discuss later, but regardless, I think it's notable to acknowledge that even when people starting right-wing backlash aren't fascists, fascists inevitably get wrapped up in their movements. Now, while none of this may necessarily be fascism, I think that fundamental aspects, the building blocks of everything we call fascism now, can be found within the colonial and imperial process. The racial paranoia and conspiracism, ideas on racial purity, acts of genocidal violence, the belief in a scapegoated other, the colonized population being subversive to the health of the nation, segregationist policy, the fear of the colonized as sneaky, duplicitous, sinful, sexually predatory manipulators, cultural erasure, and genocide. All of these things, even going by Umberto Eco's, more on him in a little bit, definition of fascism, you can see through lines. You could essentially call this process some sort of proto-fascism, the bones of what fascism will be later. Without colonialism, you never get Nazis. To tie this connection further, many people understand the Nazis as an instance of Foucault's boomerang. Foucault's boomerang is a philosophical idea where the methods of colonialism in a colonized country or land are eventually brought back home to be used against the colony, often with this language of the nation being degraded and having to be set right, returned to a more glorious state. It must be recolonized to civilize it again. It's literally bringing the racist logic of colonialism home. This place isn't civil anymore, and we need to make it civil again. And the way we make it civil is by twisting the people ruining the country back into their place by force if necessary, by punishing them for their deviance through systemic or social policy. Make America great again. When right-wingers get on TV to scream about putting down black people protesting and against trans people existing in public spaces, against gay rights, or they are expressing ideas of hate and intolerance, know what we're really seeing. Advocation for fascism, and therefore a return of colonial violence.
The worst people in our society have taken control. They did nothing to build this country. Now they are tearing it down. They are rushing us toward mass suicide. So how do we respond? We must protect ourselves and our families. Once again, we have no choice but to do that. But we cannot allow ourselves to become like they are. We are not animals. We are Americans. In the face of such indecency, we must resolve to be decent. We believe this country has a future. We intend for our children to live and thrive here. That is what we are defending.
That colonial violence is what we see and are used to every day. Police in black neighborhoods cracking down on protests to change conditions placed on us by colonialism. Sheriffs out in the country forcing indigenous people to have their land rights violated. The military setting up puppet governments in other countries or overthrowing them for better prices on resources. The use of intentionally caused drug crises as a method of warring against colonized peoples, etc. And that's why talking about fascism in America is really difficult, because you have to differentiate between the fascism that is simply the continued existence of colonial violence against black and indigenous people and people of color, and a fascist movement that's not necessarily seeking to build fascism, but to expand the fascism that already exists within this system. Fascism that expands itself as a reaction to crisis and contradiction. To speak kind of dialectically, fascism is a synthesis of a capitalist system with the material limitations and conditions of our world. To speak like someone people can actually understand, fascism is capitalism in decay, or capitalism in crisis. George Jackson's definition of fascism is actually really useful here. He knew that fascism was not something that had to be achieved in America, because it already had been. He described it as having been stabilized and built into the systems of government here. Settle your quarrels, come together, understand the reality of our situation. understand that fascism is already here, that people are already dying who could be saved, that generations more will live poor, butchered half-lives if you fail to act. Do what must be done. Discover your humanity and your love in revolution. What's unique about American fascism is that almost anything a fascist would do here is kind of already being done on some level. And when someone who's not a fascist takes office after, they don't change those conditions back. It's the ratchet effect in real time. That's what I call neoliberal fascism, when neoliberals maintain the apparatus of fascism and do nothing to fix it, while perpetuating a system that inherently breeds fascism within itself constantly. So for this video, we won't be talking about that systemic fascism, at least not focusing on it. We'll be talking more about the out and proud fascist movements and figures that have had a strong hand on this nation, and those adjacent to them. In America, a settler colonial project, meaning rather than regular colonialism, white people also replaced the indigenous population. Foucault's boomerang is here, and constantly hitting us in the goddamn face. So let me tell you a story.
Eines Morgens, als wir erwachten, Bella ciao, Bella ciao, Bella ciao, ciao, ciao. Eines Morgens, als wir erwachten, fühlen sie über uns her.
America experienced its first real whiff of fascism around the time that the Nazis were starting to really come into their power. In Europe in the 1920s, organizations like the Friends of New Germany and the German-American Bund, and fascist figures like Lawrence Dennis, fun fact he's secretly black, were fueling and defining a broadly American fascism for the first time in history. In 1933, a massive Nazi rally in Madison Square Garden drew a crowd of 20,000 people, a prelude to the 1939 rally that would draw in about the same number. The book Hitler's American Friends details how several of these groups got their start. These were what really started an overtly fascist movement in America. The first Nazi-affiliated group to spawn in the US, the prelude to the massive Nazi rallies we just mentioned, were founded in Detroit in 1924, called the National Socialist Teutonic Association. This group was formed by German immigrants who were still Nazi-affiliated. Some members had actually participated in Hitler's past-failed coup attempt, the Beer Hall Putsch, that landed him in prison. Members of this group showed support to the Nazis by sending them money and published a local newspaper. The group, being made up of pro-Nazi Germans, had an attitude among its members of wanting to eventually return to Germany and continue participating in the party, and the Teutonia Foundation provided them an outlet to remain plugged into their homeland until they returned, and members were rewarded for loyalty on return later on. The German government, though, actually had plans to establish their own office within the US in order to push for positive propaganda and foreign policy with Germany and America. This group, the Galatung USA, District Headquarters USA, or GAU USA for short, would replace the Teutonia Foundation as the official Nazi presence in the US, which would cause a lot of stupid-ass squabbling between the two groups. The fighting got settled when the Teutonia Foundation stopped being a thing and many of its members went on to the Galatung. That didn't last either, however, because when Hitler rose to power, the Nazi regime created the Friends of Germany, which would then end up squabbling with the Galatung until both groups were disbanded by the Nazi regime in 1933 and replaced with the Friends of the New Germany, which brought all of these Nazis together under the leadership of Heinz Spunknobel, and established an armed wing of men similar to the Brown Shirts who'd been beating people in the streets for Hitler, or the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers and the Three Percenters who supported Trump. In this case, they served under Heinz Spunknobel. These men were called the OD, or some German word I'm not going to try to pronounce, and as is common, would often street brawl with counter-protesters trying to shut down their hateful messaging. Between 1933 and 1935, Friends of the New Germany recruited a membership of about 5,000. This made it a small but potent force, similar to the 6,000 members of the American Communist Party in 1932. The group published 2 newspapers in the New York area, and soon opened branches in 5 other cities, including Detroit and Chicago. Despite these successes, Spunknobel himself quickly turned out to be exactly the loose cannon that the Nazi Party had tried to prevent from tarnishing its name in the United States. In 1933, he attempted to intimidate the owners of a major German-language daily paper in New York City into accepting him as a legitimate voice for the German government, only to be thrown out of their offices. Later that year, the OD painted swastikas on the doors of a Manhattan synagogue, A subsequent anti-Semitic rally in New Jersey ended in a brawl between the OD and protesters in the audience. The press once again had a field day, and dark memories of the hysteria over German espionage and subversion in World War I began to resurface in the German-American community. As World War II began, though, it became more in Germany's interest to keep America out of the war, so they threw their weight behind establishing a different group later on. In 1935, the Friends of New Germany were disbanded by the Nazi Party because its leader, Heinz Spanknobel, became a loose cannon who nearly got himself deported for being an absolute menace to society. The group's members were taken into the new German-American Bund. The Bund found its leadership in Fritz Julius Kuhn, an experienced Nazi street fighter who moved to America. He also got fired from Ford for practicing his Nazi speeches on company time. He was a former member of the Friends of New Germany, and I feel the need to really emphasize the fact that every single fascist group popping up has fed into the next. You can, if you are paying attention, draw a direct line from the Galatung and organizations before it to Oath Keepers and Proud Boys now. Back on topic though, our boy Kuhn continued to grow as a figure through the 1930s. He was often seen at New York City nightclubs listening to jazz despite his frequent denunciations of the music as Negroid, with a progression of beautiful mistresses, including a former Miss America, who there's rumors that he paid for to get an abortion at some point, which is just really on the nose. Kuhn's Bund, say that 5 times fast, would do incredible work to tie fascism to Americanism and American nationalism. Bund members marched in the streets with American flags beside Nazi ones, upheld figures like George Washington as almost mythic figures surrounded by Nazi iconography, and put on fabulous fireworks displays that drew thousands who weren't even Nazis, and provoked street fights with their members marching in Nazi-esque uniforms and committing violence like brown shirts. By all accounts, the Bund was a much more successful and more dangerous organization than his predecessors. The Bund's most well-publicized events were similarly inundated with the language of Americanism. Its most infamous event, a 1939 mass rally at Madison Square Garden that would be steeped in violence, was officially termed a pro-American rally, with George Washington birthday exercises. A description of the event proclaimed that the Bund is opposed to all isms in American public life, including Nazism and fascism, regarding these political systems as affairs of the people who live under them, supported as they are by a period of 95% of the electors in nationwide plebiscites, but impracticable and inexpedient innovations in the American system of government. At the same time, the Bund left little question as to what it did stand for, and it had some remarkable similarities to Nazism. The Bund opposes Zionism as an infectious disease gnawing at the core of American political, social, and economic life, covering an ever-widening field of activities which have already developed a power of American life which cannot be shaken off as long as the Jews control the press, the radio, the screen, and the stage. Rather than importing Nazism to the United States directly, Kuhn's entire strategy was to combine the essence of Americanism with a new and insidious version of National Socialism. Problem is that the Bund, while growing to a massive size and at one point hosting over 20,000 members and 100,000 sympathetic allies, was not what the German government really ended up needing at the time. That, on top of their inability to control Kuhn, a pattern that would arise multiple times over, meant that eventually the Bund would have to go in favor of another group. World War II was fast approaching and Germany's interests had shifted. Berlin was not laughing behind the scenes. Kuhn had already exaggerated his connections with Hitler and had been the source of embarrassment in the past. Now he had been exposed as a national security threat to the United States. What damage could he do next? Something had to be done, and quickly. The obvious solution was for the German government to deal with the Bund as it had dealt with its embarrassing predecessors, by threatening the German citizens who took part in its activities. In February 1938, a group of German government officials agreed exactly on this plan. The German ambassador dutifully informed the U.S. Secretary of State that German citizens would no longer be permitted to be members of the Bund, just as they had been forbidden to join the Friends of New Germany in its final days. But before its end, the Bund, an organization that had grown large enough to host summer camps for over 7,000 kids and featured an armed wing regularly doing street brawls and losing street brawls with anti-fascists, would have its infamous May rally. Kuhn, knowing his days as America's fascist king were numbered, facing increasing scrutiny from the press, the FBI, and the German government, would have one last moment in the sun, that Madison Square Garden rally. Over 100,000 anti-fascists would counter-protest and be suppressed by the police, a massive force of 2,000 NYPD officers. Inside the rally, a Jewish man was beaten and stripped naked by the OD on stage to thunderous applause, and 20,000 people cheered in support for fascism in America and Nazi Germany.
I pledge
undivided allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and the republic for which it stands, one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Ladies and gentlemen, fellow Americans, American patriots, I'm sure I do not come before you tonight as a complete stranger. You all have heard of me through the Jewish-controlled press as a creature with horns, a cloven hoof, and a long tail. We, with American ideals, demand that our government shall be returned to the American people who founded it.
If you ask what we are actively fighting for under our charter, first, a social, just, white, Gentile, ruled United States. Second, Gentile-controlled labor union, free from Jewish Moscow-directed domination.
This would spell Kuhn's end, though. He was arrested on embezzlement charges, his Bund offices were raided, and one of his right-hand men revealed himself to be John Metcalf, a reporter who'd been infiltrating the Bund and would testify against it and Kuhn. Metcalf alleged that the Bund's goal was to act as a spying operation for Germany, commit acts of sabotage, and reach as many German Americans as possible. Kuhn went to Sing Sing prison, and the Bund fell apart. Some members fled to Mexico, some killed themselves, and many were absorbed into other fascist groups and movements in America. But all in all, the Bund was dead. The Bund was far from the only fascist movement going on. For one, the KKK was still around. They were started after the end of slavery by a group of former Confederate soldiers and racist white people, and committed acts of terrorism against Black Americans and indigenous people, as well as Catholics and Jews. The Bund and later organizations like the Silver Legion would often have very close ties with the KKK, who took to fascism like a duck takes to water once it started becoming a thing. They were basically already doing everything a fascist would do anyway. They were very religious and very hate-fueled. A perfect recipe. Many former Klansmen became organizers for the Silver Legion. The Silver Legion grew to almost the same size as the Bund in the 1930s and existed simultaneously, though the Nazi Party would come to heavily favor the Silver Legion over the Bund, especially favoring the leader of one group over the other. The Silver Legion's leader, a Christian mystic and former film industry employee named William Dudley Pelley, was known by Hitler and his aides as the first native fascist in America. Part of what gave the Silver Legion so much clout was the fact that they weren't German. While the Bund and previous organizations like it were full of members of German descent and immigrants who were loyal to the Nazi regime, the SL were American, white, and Protestant. Though they functioned similarly, both groups were violently anti-Semitic and anti-Black, and both believed in Jewish conspiracy theories, and both supported the Nazis. Pelley was arrested for fraud in 1935 because American fascists are capitalist grifters a lot of the time, and blamed his legal issues on the cabal of Jewish bankers targeting him. His organization would grow to be about the same size as the Bund and would often work with them on the local level, but Pelley himself was not super popular. Like Kuhn, he became seen as too rowdy and hard to control after a while, and he had his own ambitions for power, hoping to create a new Christian regime with himself as the head. The regime would be made to benefit white Americans while excluding Jews and relegating Black people back to their role as slaves. Needless to say, Pelley wasn't well liked and often drew outrage and was investigated by the House Committee for Un-American Activities, the same group that Metcalf was employed by after his work with the Bund. In 1939, he was subpoenaed after Martin Diaz discovered an attempt from Pelley to put one of his publication's employees in the committee. When called to testify, Pelley went on the run around the country and his legal troubles continued to mount. All of these kind of devolve into stupid Looney Tunes antics, so I'm not going to include much of it, but basically Pelley spends much of the rest of his life in hot legal waters, and the Silver Legion goes the way of the Bund. But like the Bund, the Legion had thousands upon thousands of members, including like cops and stuff, as usual. And those members don't just disappear when their organization gets dismantled. They do what fascists do: find somewhere else to be. As World War II ramped up, it became more to Germany's interest to keep America out of the war at all costs rather than building a fascist movement in America. This is where we get the America First movement. I find it important to note that the slogan America First has always been a fascist one, that it finds its roots in being used for the benefit of a genocidal empire and the consolidation of power for American fascists. But back on the main topic, the America First campaign's goal was simple: keep America out of the war. The organization was heavily against supporting England, and even though it claimed to have no links to Hitler, its ranks drew a lot of familiar faces. Among them were former Bundists, former members of the Silver Shirts, the guys who opened the war with the KKK, members of the Christian Front, an American Christian fascist group that had risen up around the same time as groups like the Bund, rich businessmen and politicians, some of whom had a history of running their own schemes. The America First organization was from its very first inception owned by America's richest upper crusts. It started with a group of college-age law students in the early 1940s, led by one Robert D. Stewart Jr., the son of the vice chairman of Quaker Oats. The group was, as Lawrence Dennis, a local fascist, would put it, basically anti-New Deal. It was against America getting into the war only because the New Dealers seemed to be using American intervention in the war as essentially a New Deal strategy. The America Firsters, or anti-war factors, were not really pacifist or anti-war. They were anti-New Deal, and that made them anti-war in that period and situation. A lot of American businesses had assets in Germany that would be threatened if America got into the war against Germany. On top of that, they had issues with Roosevelt and his New Deal, obviously, and accused him of being a socialist. There were, among the America First coalition, businessmen like the guy who created Spam, J.C. Hormel, Robert Taft, a future presidential candidate, Henry Ford, the Ford guy, Robert E. Wood, a veteran of the Philippines War in World War I before taking high positions in the United Fruit Company, the Panama Rail Company, and Sears, as well as having some experience on the political stage. More famous businessmen joined the ranks, and so did a group called the Gold Star Moms, an organization founded by Grace Darling Saybold for the mothers of American soldiers killed in World War I. The organization was divided into localized chapters in a hierarchical structure, with its base being located in Chicago, where the largest German-American communities in the country were, and where they would receive the most local support. They surprisingly had a lot of difficulty establishing the same level of presence in southern states. According to the book Hitler's American Friends, this was possibly due to the presence of the KKK as a separate recruitment option and the power that the Democrats held in the South at the time compared to the big business interests of the Republicans. Regardless, America First was still destined to grow to a very powerful and easily established strong presence in parts of America. British intelligence that had at the time been spying on America and our Nazi-esque leanings reported that it is the raw material of American fascism. The present tactics and methods of action of the movement reveal it as the American Fifth Column, sowing racial hatred and insinuating internal division. This is the effect of its activity. Whether the process is conscious or unconscious is irrelevant. But by far their most famous and important member was the famous pilot Charles Lindbergh. Lindbergh was a heavily sympathetic figure. For one, the death of his child, maybe accidentally at the hands of Richard Hauptmann, was a massive deal. It was the cause for the passing of the new federal laws regarding kidnapping, and it was called the crime of the century at the time. This gained Lindbergh a lot of sympathy and public support. With that, he was just ridiculously famous. His speeches would leave crowds giving him standing ovations for minutes at a time before he was even done speaking. Unfortunately, he was also a eugenicist and showed some questionable levels of support to Nazi Germany, even touring their military infrastructure and voicing a very impressed attitude towards them. British intelligence described him as the one man who commands the support of the masses in the America First movement. Although he was also politically immature, untrained in democratic argument, and possessing a messianic view of politics, at the same time his apparent and adolescent honesty was a definite appeal. Lindbergh was really the only name in America First that mattered. The movement didn't last super long. For one, Lindbergh's pro-German and anti-war stances, as well as his obvious ideological symmetry with Nazis, meant that a lot of Americans actually didn't like him, and he quickly outran the goodwill he was given. There were leftist figures, politicians, and radio shows quick to denounce his anti-war stances and cut off ties with him when they experienced backlash to his ideas. And some people even called him a threat to national security. It didn't help that in 1938, while on a visit to Berlin that October, he attended a dinner at the American Embassy that featured in attendance several high-ranking German figures, and at this dinner he was awarded the Service Cross of the Order of the German Eagle by Hermann Göring, as ordered by the Führer himself. This made a lot of people pissed, and it seriously hurt his reputation more. And even in his own statements condemning obviously bad things that Germany did, he wasn't exactly tactful. I do not understand these riots on the part of the Germans. It seems so contrary to their sense of order, their intelligence in other ways. They undoubtedly had a difficult Jewish problem, but why is it so necessary to handle it unreasonably? My admiration for the Germans is constantly being dashed upon some rock such as this. What is the object in this persecution of the Jews? As the war got nastier, it became morally and politically impossible to encourage not acting. Once Pearl Harbor happened, war was inevitable, and Lindbergh himself would even end up flying in the Pacific Theater. But that potential energy for fascism they had drummed up kept humming. People who were involved in it carried on the fascist through line, the legacy. At the height of its power, America First as an org was more than capable of winning the presidency in the next election, and likely would have secured a Nazi victory in Europe. Founders of America First, like many of the more socially accepted or adept members of the fascist groups, went on to have very successful political careers, while far-right conspiracists seeking to make a buck off stoking racist and nationalist fears would follow in the footsteps of men like Father Coughlin, including the ranks of guys like Alex Jones. The first American fascists set a beat for the rest of American fascism to play off of now. This can be seen in the ways that fascism grew uniquely here, as compared to other places. For example, Nazis were extremely anti-Christian, and were pretty weirdly into like occult and pagan stuff. There's all kinds of weird stories of them doing like Frankenstein shit and trying to like summon demons and stuff and doing weird experiments on twins and stuff like that. While American fascists historically are very Christian, utilizing forms of bigotry that emphasize an unchristian nature to that which is being hated, and gives it a much stronger fervor and place to stand from. It's honestly a form of Christo-fascism that draws from the Christo-nationalism often drummed up by Republicans and the conflation of God with American will or policy. American fascists in this period were also more openly strict about their race of membership than nowadays. American fascists in this period were also more openly strict about their race of membership, while nowadays it's more quiet and subtle in some circles, and many American fascists will happily, though tenuously, accept POC members who are willing to regurgitate their racist rhetoric. One through line that's established here that still carries on is the predatory capitalistic nature of the many grifters who made bank and status off of seeming like they really gave a crap about building ideological fascism. While some fascists are anti-capitalist and some pretend to be anti-capitalist, American fascists are often grifters making bank off the movement who don't necessarily believe in anything at all other than keeping their banks full. In the case of people like Lawrence Dennis, who was, secretly black the whole time, it may be more about survival than anything else. This is pointed out in the Behind the Bastards podcast covering Lawrence Dennis, but for a lot of black people who can pass for white on some level, pretending to be white is the preferred option. And Lawrence Dennis himself expressed that he felt that fascism was inevitable in America. So it makes a lot of sense that he might want to jump on the bandwagon in order to secure his own survival under fascism. With that staunch capitalist fervor comes violent anti-communism, which is pretty common for fascism, but in America takes a more racialized appearance sometimes. It was a big thing for the KKK to conflate communism with blackness, and it was also a conspiracy that Jews were controlling black people to make us communists. Even though beyond those overtly fascist groups, there were many in the halls of power who favored Nazis. There were plenty of senators who supported Hitler. Alan Dulles, the man who we talked about briefly in my video on the surveillance state, was a Nazi sympathizer who favored Hitler over Stalin and had read the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a racist and anti-Semitic conspiracy theory that basically everyone I mentioned in this video has probably read. Operation Paperclip secured dozens of Nazi scientist roles in the US government. Some far-right groups at the time in America were supported by the police, something that arguably still happens now. And arguably, segregation and the conditions of black and brown people and queer people in the US were fascistic and still are, even without the presence of traditional fascism. That's kind of the problem with doing this early history of fascism stuff, because a lot of people who wouldn't have seen themselves as fascists were still for segregation, and still anti-black or racist, still anti-queer, still supported colonial, and therefore fascistic, violence against certain groups. There's a reason why people say fascism is what white people call colonialism and imperialism when it happens to them. lot of information in this part and not try to go super in-depth into everything, because this video is already too long and it's less meant to be a perfect in-depth look at all fascism and more like stepping back from these aspects to get a snapshot of the big picture and tie a lot of things together and give you a sense of exactly what we're dealing with. I'm sorry if this isn't enough, but I'll include in the description of this video a list of sources and places to go to get all of this information if you're missing something. I want to paint a good picture of this because a lot of people were caught off guard by everything that happened in the last 5 years, and it can be a little hard to get an idea of a linear narrative of how this happened, or a narrative of any kind, really. My ADHD brain is opposed to letting me do anything in a linear fashion that makes sense. Umberto Eco said in his essay Or Fascism that in the future we would deal with a type of fascism that spreads virally through the TV and internet. His idea for this likely came from the many fascists who'd infected the radio waves in his time to spread their hateful rhetoric. Father Coughlin, a man we discussed slightly earlier, mastered this and paved the way for fascists that would come by similar means later, like Rush Limbaugh and Alex Jones, as well as the disease that is Fox News. But before we got there, we were still dealing with American Nazis and American fascists. During the Civil Rights Movement, there was a powerful right-wing backlash that could only be seen as fascist. Martin Luther King's marches in the 60s during the Civil Rights Movement were often met with open white supremacist counter-protests. One particular example was a counter-protest in Raleigh, North Carolina in 1966, where King came to speak. Over 5,000 people showed up to watch Martin speak, and as they did, 2 local KKK chapters marched through the streets to a crowd of spectators. This was just an example of the kind of right-wing backlash often drummed up when there is advancement for oppressed peoples. That's basically what fascism is entirely, an ideology or event that springs up as an automatic, almost programmed reaction to socialistic anti-capitalist movements. And while some may incorrectly say King wasn't a socialist or anti-capitalist, he absolutely was, and the Civil Rights Movement was a movement against capitalist power relations, explicitly. The Confederate statues that went up during the Civil Rights Movement are an example of this, as are the many conservative outrages at the advancement of civil rights. Those people weren't necessarily fascists in how they identified, but in the role they were playing socially. In the performance of their conservatism, they were fascists. In my personal opinion, American conservatism is inherently fascist, but whatever. Also, we have to give a moment to discuss the Christian element to American fascism. Christianity is the primary religion in the United States. We're a culturally Christian country, and almost every US president has been a Christian. You almost can't be president in this country if you're not, because that's what the dominant social hegemony leans toward. And historically speaking, Christian imagery has always been a factor in American fascism and colonialism. Look no further than the proto-fascist colonial ideology of Manifest Destiny, which stated that God had predestined white Americans to settle and civilize the entire American continent. Christianity as a religion and its emphasis on strict patriarchal hierarchy and strict definitions of gender and strict roles, its pro-slavery inclinations and racist interpretations were perfectly ideal for finding a way to frame fascism that people would fall for. As unpopular as it seems, the dominant ideas of Christianity in this country lean toward fascism and authoritarianism. Fascists in America have always leaned on Christianity and Christian morals to implement fascism. For example, Father Coughlin's Catholicism/Christian leanings made him exceedingly popular with religious Americans and let him use Christian language to explain fascism in an attractive way, and later on presidents would do the same thing. Reagan, also known as the Devil, would ride the wave of the moral majority, an action group created by Jerry Falwell to combat moral decay, something fascists often say, all the way to the presidency. The moral majority pushed for laws against abortion, demanded prayer in schools, something that didn't ever really go away and was never really under threat anyway. And I remember being very encouraged, even yelled at by teachers for not closing my eyes during prayer, not saying the pledge, not standing during either, and stuff like that. Were aggressively homophobic, opposed the Equal Rights Act, and when they got their boy in the presidency in 1981, he allowed thousands of queer people to die horribly from a disease that they could have survived if the government had, gived a shit, and wasn't full of Christo-fascists. And then Reaganomics happened and never really went away, and Christian fundamentalists have had a strong hand on politics since then, and the Supreme Court just upheld an abortion ban in Texas, and gee, when you look at stuff that way, it almost feels like fascism won in our country, and it's been in horrible decay ever since. And Part of the build-up to the moral majority movement, besides America First, was the Christian identity movement. They basically believed the real Israelites in the Bible were Europeans, black people were subhuman, and Jews are a cursed satanic offshoot of the bloodline of Cain. One of its major proponents was George Lincoln Rockwell. Rockwell was actually the guy who organized the KKK counter-protest of MLK's march. He also ran for president once, saying that the people will welcome a man who stands unequivocally for the Christian majority. He founded the American Nazi Party in the 60s and led it until he got shot to death in a laundromat parking lot like a bitch. The government did a surprisingly large amount of work to dismantle groups like the KKK during the era of COINTELPRO, while the fascist war on drugs, war on crime, and moral panics went on through the 70s to now. The imperialist Vietnam and Korean wars, the imperialism of the war on drugs also happened, and as we established, those things related to colonialism and are therefore related on some level to fascism. We also had several openly racist and anti-Semitic presidents, and there's rumors that the guy who replaced Kennedy after he was assassinated had links to the KKK. Anyway, let's keep going, I'm sure that's not important. Fox News, yeah, Fox News. Fox News was, like a lot of conservative talk shows and radio, a natural outgrowth of several things. One, Father Coughlin's formula of using the radio to spread right-wing disinformation and racist conspiracy theories, like the Christian Front he spawned. Fox News and figures like Rush Limbaugh would fuel the rise of violent hate groups and militias with their lies, racism, and conspiracism. Fox News and others like them also fed on the racist lies used to justify colonialism and imperialism, and the racial paranoias those conditions caused in the white American cultural miasma. Ideas about black IQ and inferiority, the fear stoked during the civil rights movement and black power movement of angry black people rioting through neighborhoods looking for revenge. The fear of immigrants, these fears that had in the past justified violence, were repurposed to keep an audience terrified and coming back for more day after day, and ever more willing to spend money on whatever product or back whatever politician erased those fears. Meanwhile, no one outside of that sphere really bothered to, do anything to stop these people. Fox News forgot journalistic integrity from its conception in October 1996 at the hands of Rupert Murdoch, an Australian-American billionaire investor who owns basically every shitty news source you can think of, from the New York Post to the titular Fox News. This is where the book Alt America has come in, because it perfectly documents how Fox, alongside figures like Ann Coulter, stewed an environment for Trump to rise up in. Almost as blindingly as Donald Trump appeared on the scene, so did an array of white nationalists and supremacists, conspiracy theorists, and xenophobes, even Klansmen and skinheads and other violent radicals who, for decades, had been relegated to the fringe of right-wing politics. Hadn't they gone extinct? Most Americans did not realize that, far from going extinct, these groups had been growing and flourishing in recent years, fed by the rivulets of hate-mongering and disinformation-fueled propaganda flowing out of the right-wing media for at least a decade, and the hospitable dark environment provided by a virtual blackout in mainstream media concerning the growth of right-wing extremism. These tendencies dated back to the Bill Clinton administration when the radical right first began to try to mainstream itself as a patriot and militia movement, but was derailed largely by the violent terrorism that the movement also brewed up. Simultaneously, right-wing media began appearing as a new propaganda type that openly eschewed journalistic standards of mainstream news organizations. In a classic use of newspeak, they declared themselves fair and balanced. Before Obama's election, there was already a wealth of conspiracy theories floating around in this environment. Ideas and paranoias about the New World Order, which was basically the same communist Jews control the world conspiracy that the Christian Front and other groups believed in, were very popular already. The whole adrenochrome vampire elites thing that Alex Jones pushed is a natural outgrowth of these same conspiracies that fueled the early fascist movements in America, the QAnon movement especially. These conspiracy theories found their origin in an old conspiracy, one that had fueled the Nazis and the head of the CIA, Allen Dulles, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Written in 1903, this book laid out the totally real and definitely not made up for racism reasons plan for Jewish global domination. Most of the damn thing was plagiarized from various sources and was obviously fake, but so many dumbass people fell for the book and its lies that hundreds of millions low-key ended up dying partially because of it. Let that be a lesson to you kids. Books are bad and you should never read. Just bury your head in the dirt and refuse to think about it. Refuse to think about anything. Bury your head in the dirt and pray that you suffocate before the fascism or the climate change or the horrifying plague gets to you. And of course, like Father Coughlin, Alex Jones and those of his kin made insane money off of pretending to believe in these conspiracy theories. Jones himself made his debut in 1996, pushing the NWO conspiracy and denying the reality of the Oklahoma City bombing, saying the government faked it, as well as making the Bush did 9/11 thing a thing. The publication of the book The Turner Diaries is also pretty significant. If you don't know what that is, The Turner Diaries is a horrible, horrible book that promotes the violent overthrow of the US government and the genocide of all non-white people around the world. In the book, there's an event called the Day of the Rope, where race traitors and non-white people and whoever else fascists lump in all get lynched and hung from street lamps and such. Not fun stuff, but the book has a connection to a lot of American fascists. The movement against gun control was partially fueled by these NWO conspiracy theories, and these ideas motivated a lot of people to violence, and spawned the militia movement from the 60s onward, which was a collection of localized conspiracist, often white supremacist fascist militia groups that existed in opposition to the government. Events like Waco and Ruby Ridge of the government trying to crack down on these kinds of groups, and the carnage caused by the government in the process, became more fodder, and by the time Obama's presidency came around, a ticking time bomb had been set, and no one really bothered to address it. No one talked about it in schools, or the news ignored as much of it as possible. Rising hate crime waves went almost unreported, and were going up before Trump ever applied to be on the ballot. As the book Alt America explains, a lot of people were pissed and galvanized by Obama's election. Almost as soon as it was shown that he was a serious candidate, there were conspiracy theories. Obama's secretly a Muslim from Africa who lied about his birth certificate and will institute Sharia law. The internet became a haven for this kind of stuff as well. A lot of early internet chat boards, sites like 4chan and Reddit, websites like the Daily Stormer, and the comment sections of far-right figures' YouTube and Twitter profiles. The anonymity of the internet gave everyone who was in their heart a racist or fascist but afraid to say it, a way to express it. Websites like YouTube pushed people further and further down right-wing rabbit holes until it was promoting overtly racist and fascist content to them. By the time Trump took office, the era of the Southern strategy was on its last legs, and Trump went on ahead and killed it dead. This was a signature trope of Trump's campaign. Trump didn't avail himself of the coded dog whistle signals that conservatives had learned to employ when they spoke about race, ethnicity, crime, and immigration. He called this kind of euphemistic prevarication political correctness, and he intended to smash it to tiny pieces and say what he knew his listeners already thought. Right-wing politicians had for years relied on this coy rhetoric because naked racial attacks hurt them in opinion polls. This rhetorical dancing around also spared them from being attacked for their racism, while allowing them to communicate to their audiences that their biases aligned with those of their white suburban and rural base, which, it emerged, continued to embrace racist tropes and stereotypes about people of color, regardless of the broader social stigma in doing so. This was made manifestly clear by the ardent following that Trump immediately developed for his anti-PC style of campaigning. Instead of plummeting in the polls, like many expected after Trump's wildly controversial opening speech, his approval ratings climbed, and climbed, and climbed. Suddenly, all of these people who had spent their time existing on the fringes of American politics weren't fringe. Trump was a bandwagon they could ride, and the momentum he gave them would carry them until he was gone from office. And by then, the movement would no longer need him.
Mi sono alzato, oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao. Stamattina mi sono alzato e ho trovato l'invaso, oh partigiano, portami via.
So let's try and tie together what we've discussed so far with some new information. Also, Chill Goblin's video on colonialism and fascism has a part where he says people should look at their own country and run down the list of traits of fascism that Umberto Eco outlines, and I was working on this video weeks before he reached out to me to voice Fanon in that video, but turns out I'm doing the thing he said to do. So, cool, the left really does share one brain cell. How's that for an echo chamber? A little background, Or Fascism was published in 1995 by Umberto Eco. He had lived through Mussolini's regime as a child, and gives an account of what his life was like before the beginning of the actual descriptions of fascism in the essay. He recalls living among the fighting between fascists and partisans, the communist revolutionaries that took on a primary role in the fight against fascism in Italy, and the period of time after the war of reconstruction and recontextualizations, through seeing the full extent of what fascism had done to Europe and how people sought to move forward. In my country today, there are some who say that the War of Liberation was a tragic period of division, that all we need is national reconciliation. The memory of those terrible years should be repressed, refoulé, verdrant. But Verdangung causes neuroses. If reconciliation means compassion and respect for all those who fought in their own war in good faith, to forgive does not mean to forget. I can even admit that Eichmann sincerely believed in his mission, but I cannot say, okay, come back and do it again. We are here to remember what happened and solemnly say that they must not do it again. But who are they? If we still think of the totalitarian governments that ruled Europe before the Second World War, we can easily say that it would be difficult for them to reappear in the same form in different historical circumstances. If Mussolini's fascism was based upon the idea of a charismatic ruler, on corporatism, on the utopia of the imperial fate of Rome, on the imperialistic will to conquer new territories, on an exacerbated nationalism, on the idea of an entire nation regimented in black shirts, on the rejection of parliamentary democracy, on anti-Semitism, then I have no difficulty in acknowledging that today the Italian Alleanza Nazionale, born from the post-war fascist party MSI, and certainly a right-wing party, has by now very little to do with the old fascism. In the same vein, even though I am much concerned about the various Nazi-like movements that have arisen here and in Europe and including Russia, I do not think that Nazism in its original form is about to reappear as a nationwide movement. The first part of that quote obviously hits me for obvious reasons. After years of Trump protesters literally fighting Trump's police in the streets, and a literal ongoing war between anti-fascists and fascists that has now devolved into shooting matches in the street on a regular basis, Biden's calls for unity seemed and still seem foolish.
This is a great nation. We're a good people. And to overcome the challenges in front of us requires the most elusive of all things in a democracy: unity.
That same message echoed by the three former presidents who attended Biden's inauguration, former Presidents Obama, Bush, and Clinton.
As Americans, we have more in common than what separates us.
The word Echo uses there, refoler and verdrangt, both mean to repress or suppress in terms of psychology and thought. What he's saying is that there are people in Italy calling for the entire war and memories of it to simply be repressed, pushed aside, and forgotten or ignored. This represented in how America and many liberals refuse to even say Trump's name, thinking that if we treat him like Voldemort and never speak of him, he'll go away. This is a great error. I think we've learned the hard way enough times in history now that fascists can't be ignored. They will fester. They cannot be completely reduced to jokes because people will fail to see them as a coming threat. In a way, the push to forget Trump and his movement is a form of gaslighting, telling a bruised child they're not actually bruised because you're not willing to do what it needs to be done to heal it, telling a nation it's not sick when there's blood spots on the handkerchief. Fascists cannot be ignored. It's been proven time and time again in recent weeks in LA, last January in San Diego, and across the entire country. When you allow fascists to gather and don't stop them, they go out looking for attention. They commit hate crimes. They beat people in the street, assault journalists. We're being called to unity with people who are impossible to unify with if you have a skin tone darker than printer paper. On top of that, though, Echo also mentioned the main point of the essay. It's a thesis, sort of, that fascism cannot rise in the exact form twice, but that it can shift and reform for a new time over and over again, putting on a slightly new face for a slightly new crowd every time it rises. The importance of this work lies in the fact that there are no two fascists that are the same. A fascist in America is going to be different from a fascist in England or Ukraine or India, but they share certain elements. Calling cards, behaviors, and ideas among fascists echo and reflect each other on some level. Fascism became an all-purpose term because one can eliminate from a fascist regime one or more features and it will still be recognizably fascist. Take away imperialism from fascism and you still have Franco and Salazar. Take away colonialism and you still have the Balkan fascism of the Ustashis. Add to the Italian fascism a radical anti-capitalism, which never much fascinated Mussolini, and you have Ezra Pound. Add a cult of Celtic mythology and the Grail mysticism, completely alien to official fascism, and you have one of the most respected fascist gurus, Julius Evola. I'm kind of surprised we haven't mentioned Evola like a single time this entire video, considering it's a video on fascism. Come to think of it, I don't think I've ever really stopped to talk about Evola, huh? It's too late to do that now, I'm already recording this skit. Real quick, these 14 points, no, not that one, are kind of long quotes, and I don't want the whole video to just be me, like, reading at you, but that might end up being what this is, so just roll with me, yeah? I wrote that line before I knew how long I would make this video. The first feature of Fascism is the cult of tradition. Traditionalism is, of course, much older than fascism. Not only was it typical of counter-revolutionary Catholic thought after the French Revolution, but it was born in the late Hellenistic era as a reaction to classical Greek rationalism. In the Mediterranean basin, people of different religions, most of them indulgently accepted by the Roman pantheon, started dreaming of a revelation received at the dawn of human history. This revelation, according to the traditionalist mystique, had remained for a long time concealed under the veil of forgotten languages, in Egyptian hieroglyphs, in the Celtic runes, in the scrolls of the little-known regions of Asia. This new culture had to be syncretic. Syncretism is not only, as the dictionary says, the combination of different forms of belief or practice. Such a combination must tolerate contradictions. Each of the original messages contains a sliver of wisdom, and whenever they seem to say different or incompatible things, it is only because they are all alluding allegorically to the same primeval truth. As a consequence, there can be no advancement of learning. Truth has already been spelled out once and for all, and we can only keep interpreting its obscure message. The most influential theoretical source of the theories of the new Italian right, Julius Evola, merged the Holy Grail with the protocols of the Elders of Zion, alchemy with the Holy Roman and Germanic Empire. The very fact that the Italian right, in order to show its open-mindedness, recently broadened its syllabus to include works by De Maistre, Guénon, and Gramsci, is blatant proof of syncretism. Okay, long quote, but let's break it down a bit and explain its links to today, which you're probably already thinking of. Firstly, what does this even mean? To simplify, Eco is saying that fascism's first trait is a cult of tradition that is syncretic. This idea that we must stick to our traditions, but those traditions are constructed or cherry-picked to suit fascists who will often pull from or synchronize things from different sources into their ideology. It's why the Nazis were really into forms of paganism that were fundamentally separate from Germany's own culture, even as they claimed to be preserving that culture. Savitri Devi is an excellent example of syncretism, as a Nazi who was also Hindu and who pulled those beliefs into the Nazi zeitgeist. I think we can also point out that there are elements of Christianity that are like this. A lot of sermons are just constant reinterpretations of the Bible, a lot of the time saying a lot of the same things. And there's an interpretation of the Bible where all of it is meant to be seen as this coherent, unifying message that all of it connects to, when in reality there are parts of the Bible that contradict themselves, and parts of the Bible that contextually aren't really related to other parts. But they're all synchronized and synthesized into a single coherent narrative, and contradictions are ignored. This quote also reminds me of the work of guys like Jordan Peterson and Joseph Campbell, who both believed in this idea of all stories and cultures in history being connected, syncretic, and the need to draw maps of meaning between these different stories in order to create an ideology and tradition and live a better life. You may know Joseph Campbell from the idea of the monomyth depicted in his book The Hero with a Thousand Faces. Also, like Jordan Peterson, Campbell was also pretty popular with fascists in the far right, which isn't me saying that either of them are themselves fascists, but it's notable that there's a through line between their thinking and the fascists who would be their fanboys. This syncretism happens not only on the scale of mythology and such, but like pop culture as well. For example, the taking the red pill thing that was stolen from the Matrix, a blatantly trans and leftist narrative. And the concept of power levels taken from Dragon Ball Z. Two really lame examples of fascist behavior, because the real number one trait is that fascists are lame as hell. The cult of traditionalism is a very obvious and easy one, and one you see in America often already, with the right wing's insistence on preserving American traditional values, which is really just a bastardized and ahistorical form of Christianity. When you hear conservative culture warring or inciting moral panic over anything that doesn't fit Judeo-Christian values, this is part of their fascism. This idea that anything that does not fit their very strict idea of American traditions is the devil and must be repressed politically and socially. The idea that anything atraditional is itself a violence against Americans. You see this in how the right reacts to expressions of black culture, LGBT people, or non-traditional ideas on gender and gender expression. An easy recent example is Lil Nas X's music video for Call Me By Your Name, which is profoundly gay and stretches traditional expressions of gender extremely far. Prince, Grace Jones, and other black artists that stretch gender norms received this reaction. People were so angry over Nas X's music video that they were calling for violence and suppression of the video. You also see this in the use of conversion therapy, essentially concentration camps for LGBT people to correct their non-traditional behavior. and expressions, and the way parents are encouraged to behave in violent and totalitarian ways toward their kids to make them adhere to traditional American values. One of the most significant aspects of American fascism is that it is a form of Christo-Fascism and is heavily religious. This separates American fascists from German fascists, who were very anti-religious. It even is said explicitly by figures like Tucker Carlson that American values are inherently Judeo-Christian. And this is where syncretism comes in as well, because one of these traditions in mind when people talk about American values is Christmas, which is a pagan holiday. No, really, Christmas as we understand it comes from two sources, Roman and Nordic cultures. In Rome, there was a holiday called Saturnalia, which was kind of like Fat Tuesday during Mardi Gras, where the whole point was just to be as hedonistic as possible. It was a celebration for people to just go off. In Nordic cultures, they had Yule, which is where the word Yuletide comes from. That kind of carried most of the aesthetic of Christmas. In fact, for a long time in America, Christmas was illegal and wasn't a real holiday until 1870. Americans didn't even really like celebrating it because it was mostly a British thing, and I guess we had beef with them or something. I'm not sure why. Something tea, something burning the White House. I didn't watch the documentary. Oh god, that was just the first trait. Oh god, I have to cut this down. This is gonna be so fucking hard to edit. Traditionalism implies the rejection of modernism. Both fascists and Nazis worship technology, while traditionalist thinkers usually reject it as a negation of traditional spiritual values. However, even though Nazism was proud of its industrial achievements, its praise of modernism was only the surface of an ideology based upon blood and earth, Blood und Boden. The Enlightenment, the Age of Reason, is seen as the beginning of modern depravity. In this sense, or fascism can be defined as irrationalism. Now, this is a bit complicated because there is a cult of irrationalism and a tendency of American fascists to distrust intellectuals and experts. Kind of. See, much like the right's reaction to politics in comics, where it's not no politics, but only our politics, irrationalism here is the same, where it's not necessarily no science, or no logic, or no enlightenment, but only science, logic, or enlightenment that affirms my beliefs. Not no history, but only history that suits my beliefs. In her video on Jordan Peterson and nihilism, Abigail Thorne illustrates this point very well when she brings up Sam Harris's ideas on culture. You see this behavior in how transphobes talk about objective ideas of gender and sex being one and the same, but dismiss any science that doesn't affirm those beliefs the same way Sam Harris dismisses culture that doesn't suit his ideas. You also see it in how anti-vaxxers, a group that tends to be fascist or fascism adjacent, selectively pick science that suits their ideas and dismisses science that contradicts it. Even the boldest flat earth QAnon weirdos aren't anti-science, they're just anti-science that doesn't affirm their beliefs, and super excited about any science that does.
I got up in the morning, got tested, and turns out I got COVID. Immediately threw the kitchen sink at it. All kinds of meds, monoclonal antibodies, ivermectin, Z-Pak.
Fascism's irrationalism is not a worship of being irrational, but a rejection of any rational ideas that do not suit their needs, and a replacement of them with their own intellectuals and their own rationale, and a refusal to have those ideas honestly engage in conflict. Part of how they achieve this is by twisting the meanings of their enemies' ideas in the first place. Old Nazis talked about cultural Bolshevism, while in the modern day they talk about postmodern neo-Marxism, or replace words like authoritarianism with communism. Irrationalism also depends on the cult of action for action's sake, action being beautiful in itself. It must be taken before or without any previous reflection. Thinking is a form of emasculation. Therefore, culture is suspect insofar as it is identified with critical attitudes. When I hear talk of culture, I reach for my gun. Now, I think we can stop there and already apply this to our modern day. You only need to turn on Fox News for a few minutes to hear a bunch of rich elitists and intellectuals complain about rich elitists and intellectuals to convince you they're on your side against the terrible rich elitists and intellectuals. There is a culture of reaction without actual proper thought or basis in history or science or actual logic, just a reaction. A cult of taking action to defend culture or supremacy or any perceived disloyalty. A cult of action and how lone wolf stochastic terrorism is encouraged and festers online among crypto-fascists. A cult of action in declaring anyone left of you an Antifa militant and attacking them as such. Of starting fights in the street for the sheer satisfaction of it, even when the other side has a clear tactical advantage. Everyone sees themselves as the main character, a hero taking much-needed direct and violent action against enemies. There is no de-escalating or logically talking your way out of these encounters because they have nothing to do with thought. Thought is disloyal and weak. They have everything to do with the binary thinking of the in-group, which must be fought for, and the out-group, which must be crushed. It's why Trump rallies and anti-vax rallies often end with violence or feature it. Any person walking by showing displeasure at the rally is Antifa. Anyone who voices opposition is Antifa. Anyone who objects is Antifa. And Antifa is funded by the Democratic Party, who are a group of pedophiles who eat kids and therefore are the greatest possible evil, so any kind of violence is acceptable. Moving on. No synchronistic faith can withstand analytical criticism. Critical spirit makes distinctions, and to distinguish is a sign of modernism. In modern culture, the scientific community praises disagreement as a way to improve knowledge. For fascism, disagreement is treason. This is kind of complicated because the right in America claims to celebrate and desire diversity of thought, but it's not true. Kind of goes back to the no politics, just our politics. The only acceptable quote-unquote diversity of thought leans right. And over time, the hierarchy will shrink to those further and further right. Everyone insufficiently loyal will be purged until there's no one left. It's been brought up by Innuendo Studios before, but white fascism is a suicide cult because there will always be someone who's not white enough. Fascism defines itself by its opposition. Without an enemy, it's meaningless. The in-group only matters when there's an out-group to compare yourself to. You see this in right-wing circles online where people being pushed down the far-right pipeline are encouraged to do things like break ties with family members to become more and more dedicated to the movement. And those who refuse to do things like this, those who object to violence on the ground, who turn in fellow members when they feel they've gone too far, are hated and punished. Oh shit, are we talking about LAPD? I thought we were talking about fascists. Oh wait. The obsession with diversity of opinions only applies when the broad swath of those opinions benefits them. When they don't, this is no longer true. Not no politics, just only our politics. Not diversity of thought, but diversity of thought that benefits me. Besides, disagreement is a sign of diversity, or fascism grows up and seeks for consensus by exploiting and exacerbating the natural fear of difference. The first appeal of a fascist or prematurely fascist movement is an appeal against the intruders. Thus, or fascism is racist by definition. I doubt we need to work hard to find an example of this. Just look at how Fox News talks about immigrants, the way they responded to the migrant caravan a few years ago, saying these people were coming to wage war, that they're a disease, calling them illegals and thus stripping them of humanity, while giving a sense that the whole of their relevance is that they are illegal. A whole person with a complicated history affected by the socioeconomic actions committed by this empire, relegated to just the word illegal, as if the entire rest of the context of why they're there in the first place and what this country did to get them there intentionally is irrelevant, because for some reason the only thing that matters is that they're illegal. They're not us. Do we need to explain this? I mean, I feel like it kind of speaks for itself. On some levels, a lot of these aspects share some overlap, and some examples I can just reuse for other points. It's all kind of muddled. Or fascism derives from individual or social frustration. That is why one of the most typical features of the historical fascism was the appeal to a frustrated middle class, a class suffering from an economic crisis or feelings of political humiliation and frightened by the pressure of lower social groups. In our time, when the old proletarians are becoming petty bourgeois and the lumpen are largely excluded from the political scene, the fascism of tomorrow will find its audience in this new majority. Yeah, I mean, this is absolutely true. Most of Trump's base were and are the upper middle class. Upper middle class white people whose businesses benefited from his policies, who are frustrated with the effects of capitalism that they struggle with from those above them and feel pressure from those below them agitating for better wages and rights and such. Fascism is a revolution of the middle class, the way socialism is a revolution for the proletariat. which is not to say that working class people aren't also sucked in, sowing racial hatred and hatred of minorities, playing to the normalization of colonial violence, playing to the social hierarchies a lot of people still find it important to impose, can give people that same sense. There's a bunch of ruling elites killing the world and a bunch of angry people who are less than me trying to get at you too, and you've got to stop them all. To people who feel deprived of a clear social identity, or fascism says that their only privilege is the most common one, to be born in the same country. Besides, the only ones who can provide an identity to the nation are its enemies. Thus, at the root of fascist psychology, there is the obsession with a plot. The followers must feel besieged, but the plot must also come from the inside. Jews are usually the best target because they have the advantage of being at the same time inside and outside. In the US, a prominent instance of the plot obsession is to be found in Pat Robertson's The New World Order. This one's fairly obvious, I think. There's a lot of this behavior with the QAnon New World Order conspiracies, or the way that Fox News talks about Antifa and BLM, or crime even.
The worst people in our society have taken control. They did nothing to build this country. Now they are tearing it down. They are rushing us toward mass suicide. We are not animals. We are Americans. In the face of such indecency, we must resolve to be decent. We believe this country has a future. We intend for our children to live and thrive here. That is what we are defending.
As if the country is besieged by this powerful enemy army that just rose up from within our borders and is tearing our city down and burning them to ash. The part about being an enemy that is both inside and outside is a huge one, because a lot of white Americans have this paranoia of being invaded on all sides by Muslims, Mexicans, black people from the inner city, and China. This is a behavior that a lot of Americans who wouldn't see themselves as fascists fall into. Even if you believe those stereotypes are completely untrue, we've been raised in a society that assumes that they were most of the time, and for a long time those assumptions are still baked often deep into one's instincts. I've had close friends and comrades express ideas or reactions to me in a heated moment that were racist on instinct. It's something to watch out for within ourselves. The hierarchies enforced in our society are very deeply ingrained. The followers must feel humiliated by the ostentatious wealth and force of their enemies. When I was a boy, I was taught to think of the Englishmen as the 5-meal people. They ate more frequently than the poor but sober Italians. Jews are rich and help each other through a secret web of mutual assistance. However, their followers must be convinced that they can overwhelm the enemies. Thus, by a continuous shifting of rhetorical focus, the enemies are at the same time too strong and too weak. Fascist governments are condemned to lose wars because they are constitutionally incapable of objectively evaluating the force of the enemy. Oh look, I don't have to really do much for this one. You already gave us an example. I mean, if we want more examples, we can look at how white people will say that black people are lazy, stupid, and inferior, and overall a joke, but also have an extreme fear of black people and think we're all dangerous and aggressive, and call us things like super predators. For fascism, there is no struggle for life. For fascism, there is no struggle for life, but rather life is lived for struggle. Thus, pacifism is trafficking with the enemy. It is bad because life is permanent warfare. This, however, brings about an Armageddon complex. Since enemies have been defeated, there must be a final battle after which the movement will have control of the world. But such a final solution implies a further era of peace, a golden age, which contradicts the principle of permanent war. No fascist leader has ever succeeded in solving this predicament. Yeah, and American fascists won't either. I think we've come to accept that as a nation. A state of permanent war, I mean. In fact, American culture really does have a sort of war fetishism problem. This obsession with violence, the killing, the tools and tactics of war. And I'm saying this as someone who fucking loved COD as a kid. I mean, I stopped loving it because of all the toxic ass people that I had to play it with, and also because military bad, ? This is another thing that's displayed across the American political spectrum. There are plenty of people who aren't openly fascist but are pro-US foreign policy because they fall for the exceptionalist myth that America is this special moral place. Elitism is a typical aspect of any reactionary ideology, insofar as it is fundamentally aristocratic, and aristocratic and militaristic elitism cruelly implies contempt for the weak. Or fascism can only advocate a popular elitism. Every citizen belongs to the best people of the world. The members of the party are the best among the citizens. Every citizen can, or ought to, become a member of the party. We can stop there with this quote. The rest doesn't necessarily apply, or at least I can't think of how, But this is something that is normalized in American culture. American exceptionalism is an idea heavily pushed in schools. It's assumed in political conversations about any other country. It's even in military ads. It's especially present in Christian fundamentalism too. The idea of American exceptionalism originates from the Bible, after all. Liberals, conservatives, and outright fascists all often carry this trait. Liberals especially like this idea that America is the most free and most fair country in the world, that we invented democracy and we're here to protect it worldwide, when in reality most governments put in place by the US or post-colonial imperialist forces are outright fascist, because colonialism never actually ended. They think of the US as a shining city on the hill, an idea that was first expressed in the Bible, or that comes directly from the Bible, and once again relates back to Christian identity, Christian fundamentalism, and Southern lost causism. In such a perspective, everybody is educated to become a hero. In every mythology, the hero is an exceptional being. But in fascist ideology, heroism is the norm. The cult of heroism is strictly linked with the cult of death. It is not by chance that a motto of the Phalangists was Viva la Muerte. In English, it should be translated as Long Live Death. In non-fascist societies, the lay of the public is told that death is unpleasant, but must be faced with dignity. Believers are told that it is the painful way to reach a supernatural happiness. By contrast, the fascist hero craves heroic death, advertised as the best reward for a heroic life. The fascist hero is impatient to die. In his impatience, he more frequently sends other people to death. This example is a pretty obvious one. It's pretty clear in the way that our country talks about the US military, for example, and emphasizes, oh, they're all heroes. Or talked about essential workers and nurses and such during the pandemic. Oh, they're all heroes. Or talked about how people should be going back to work during the pandemic even though it was still going on, because it's heroic to die for the economy. And in all this time spent calling these people heroes, none of them are really getting treated well. Nurses are still being underpaid. Essential workers are still being underpaid, still losing their jobs. And overall, this cult of heroism is really just a cover for fascists to be able to send the rest of us to go die for whatever cause they want us to die for. Since both permanent war and heroism are difficult games to play, the fascist transfers his will to power to sexual matters. This is the origin of machismo, which implies both disdain for women and intolerance and condemnation of non-standard sexual habits, from chastity to homosexuality. Since even sex is a difficult game to play, the fascist hero tends to play with weapons. Doing so becomes an ersatz-phallic exercise. Okay, Echo didn't have to come for Ben Shapiro so goddamn hard here, but okay, let's go. Good for him.
Today, if I did not discuss one of the great issues of our time, and that is that the actress Ellen Page, who is, was, and shall remain a woman, is now a man. So let me read you the headline from CNN, which conveys zero information. Right, we have now been forced as a society to simply say nonsense, to simply just say things that are nonsense, that don't make any sort of logical sense, that don't actually translate from English to reason. Okay, so here is the headline, and you tell me if you know what the hell this means. Okay, ready? Elliot Page, Juno star, shares transgender identity. Do you have any idea what that means? Like, seriously, do you have any idea what that means?
This is a pretty obvious one that plays out in social circles all over the political spectrum, because masculinity and misogyny are hierarchies that a lot of people benefit from and have become used to. I know plenty of men in anarchist circles who can't let go of that male privilege and therefore become a problem and a danger in a community who all reject hierarchy, because they have an expectation of being worshipped or obeyed or respected in a way that they haven't really earned, and become angry when people don't listen to them when they make bad suggestions that put people in danger, and also make efforts to reestablish certain hierarchies, especially misogynistic and homophobic hierarchies within anarchistic circles. In conservative and leftist circles, there can be found levels of transphobia that can become violent. It's certainly worse on one side, though. On the right, there is especially this tendency to conflate homosexuality and queerness/transness in general to pedophilia, and then to stir up anti-trans violence under that guise. Fascism is based upon a selective populism, a qualitative populism, one might say. In a democracy, the citizens have individual rights, but the citizens in their entirety have a political impact only from a quantitative point of view. One follows the decisions of the majority. For fascism, however, individuals as individuals have no rights, and the people is conceived as a quality, a monolithic entity expressing the common will. Since no large quantity of human beings can have a common will, the leader pretends to be their interpreter. Having lost their power of delegation, citizens do not act. They are only called on to play the role of the people. Thus, the people is only a theatrical fiction. To have a good instance of qualitative populism, we no longer need the Piazza Venezia in Rome or the Nuremberg Stadium. There is in our future a TV or internet populism in which the emotional response of a selected group of citizens can be presented and accepted as the voice of the people. Oh, so it's bullshit populism, like the moral majority or silent majority thing that fascists like Reagan or Trump do when they all pretend that their will represents the will of all people while excluding any voices that don't benefit them. That's easy. Next. Okay, all joking aside, Fox News definitely does that a lot, though. They use nationalism to aid that, and then they say stuff like, oh, real Americans know this, or real Americans hate that, or whatever. Americans don't want this, they want that. Americans don't like this, they like that. While excluding Americans who disagree. Bullshit populism. Fascism speaks Newspeak. Newspeak was invented by Orwell in 1984 as the official language of INGSOC, English socialism. But elements of fascism are common to different forms of dictatorship. The Nazi or fascist school books made use of an impoverished vocabulary and an elementary syntax in order to limit the instruments for complex and critical reasoning. But we must be ready to identify other kinds of newspeak, even if they take the apparently innocent form of a popular talk show.
I am concerned about the rise of any group of hate. I don't like it. Any group of hate, I am, whether it's white supremacy, whether it's any other kind of supremacy, whether it's Antifa, whether it's any group of hate, I am very concerned about it, and I'll do something about it.
This, though, all throughout history, every time we've seen a country follow into Marxism, and as that changes, this is what happens, and it's happening right now in America. So I have a term for that. I call it corporate communism. Corporate communism destroys small businesses in America.
If you think this question is absurd and that no one thinks this way, you would be very much mistaken. Many people do. And what's even more disturbing, many of these people were born and live in the West. In other words, they've come to despise their own culture. This thinking is the product of a doctrine widely taught in our schools. It's known as multiculturalism, the belief that all cultures are equal. Or to put it another way, no culture's values, art, music, political system, or literature are better or worse than any other.
Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. Happy Monday. One of the great unsolved mysteries of the past 4 years is why certain types of people with certain types of jobs hate Donald Trump so much, really hate him, obsess over him. Think about him when they wake up in the morning, would hurt him if they
All of the ancients, whether you're talking about Judeo-Christian values or Greek philosophers, all of them believed that happiness had to do with the sense of moral purpose. The tension between Jerusalem and Athens, the interplay, that is what built the West. That is what built the greatest civilization in the history of mankind.
Una mattina mi sono alzato. Bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao. Una mattina mi sono.
The thing is that a lot of these traits of fascism apply to a lot of people. I think that the reason for this isn't because everyone's secretly an evil fascist, but it's cultural. In a culture built on exploitation, colonial violence, racism, and capital, the hierarchies created to further those things become very deeply ingrained into the culture and into our minds. People build our lives, social circles, personalities, and personas on the way we're taught to view and interact with the world by schools, by family, whether racist or prejudiced or not, and by the violence and racism inherent in the world around us. And that mind, if it's not decolonized and made to be aware of this process, always leans a little toward fascism. You are not immune to propaganda. That's why so much of the work of decolonization, fighting white supremacy, racism, misogyny, hierarchy, and all of those fun words that people who read too many fucking books like to say, is a really personal and existential process. Unpacking our colonial conceptions of sex, gender, race, masculinity, femininity, violence, justice, work, laziness, faith, God, and everything is a lot of intense soul searching that some people just won't want to do. They want a simple solution. And the fact is, we as a species have always been swayed by hateful people, hurting the people we hate with simple solutions, and saying the right words to us, or by a hierarchy that promises us a spot above somebody else, or by someone who knows how to appeal to our fears or our privileges. If we don't build power in our community through mutual aid, through care networks, through defense groups, through local climate resilience and dual power, we will watch more of our neighbors fall to this sickness too. Love kills fascism. Empathy kills fascism. Empowered groups of people living and working together as equals to meet their material needs, as comrades, as a community, that kills fascism. Our collective power kills fascism. That is the machine that kills fascists. This machine kills fascists.